The room went quiet, the way glass goes quiet before it shatters. He thought he was humiliating me in front of the investor, in front of the lead counsel, in front of everyone who mattered. What he didn't realize was that the acquisition had already begun, and I was the only one who knew how it would end. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and overbrewed coffee, the kind that lingers like tension you pretend not to notice. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city in silver light, all sharp edges and ambition. At the center of it stood him, the new VP, tailored suit, perfect posture, voice already calibrated to command. "Do you know who I am?" he barked, not at the room, but at me. The question didn't echo. It sliced. A few junior analysts froze mid-note. Someone near the glass wall shifted in their seat. The investor, calm and unreadable, adjusted his cuff as if this were just another Tuesday. And the lead counsel, seated to the right with a leather folder open, watched the exchange with a lawyer's patience, waiting for something to reveal itself. I could have answered the question. I could have listed his credentials from memory. I had read his profile before dawn, studied the strategic reshuffle that had brought him here just days before the acquisition vote. Instead, I let the silence breathe, because he wasn't really asking who he was asking who I was allowed to be. The presentation slide behind him glowed with the word acquisition in bold serif font, as though the typography alone could intimidate a room. The numbers beneath it were impressive, projected growth curves climbing like well-trained vines. But projections are polite lies. Reality is a different animal. "I'm leading this negotiation," he continued, pacing once sharply. "And I won't tolerate interference from operations?" "Operations?" He said it like a storage closet, a murmur barely audible. My team sat at the far end of the table, their expressions carefully neutral. They knew what this meant. They had seen it before. Someone new, someone loud, someone convinced that experience could be downloaded like a template. I folded my hands on the table, fingertips cool against the polished surface. "Interference?" I repeated softly. His smile was thin. "Your last-minute compliance memo. It's unnecessary. The investor is satisfied. Lead counsel has reviewed the terms. We're aligned." Aligned? The word hung there, too symmetrical to be true. I glanced at lead counsel. His pen had stopped moving. That detail, small, almost invisible, tightened something in my chest. Lawyers don't stop writing unless something is worth remembering. "My memo outlines 3 unresolved liabilities tied to the subsidiary assets," I said, keeping my voice level. "If we close without addressing them, the exposure shifts, permanently." A pause. The investor leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but interest. He hadn't heard about unresolved liabilities, not in this tone. The VP exhaled through his nose. "We don't need theatrics." It wasn't theatrics. It was math. Outside, a siren wailed faintly and disappeared, swallowed by the city. Inside, the air felt heavier, like the seconds before a storm cracks open. He stepped closer to my side of the table. "You're not in this lane," he said, quieter now, but sharper. "Stay in your function." Stay in your function? The words landed like a verdict. I slid my business card across the table, not dramatically, not with defiance. Just a simple motion, paper gliding over wood until it stopped in front of lead counsel. He looked down. For a moment, the room felt suspended, like a breath held underwater. The title beneath my name wasn't new. It hadn't changed in years. But most people only see what they expect to see. And he had expected operations. He hadn't expected oversight. Lead counsel read it once, then again. His eyes lifted, not to me, but to the investor. That glance lasted less than a second. It was enough. Unresolved liabilities? He asked calmly. Unresolved liabilities? He asked calmly. The VP opened his mouth, but I answered first. Yes. 3. 1 environmental exposure in the Midwest property portfolio. 2 pending arbitration cases buried in footnotes, and a compliance breach tied to a third-party vendor that hasn't been disclosed in the acquisition brief. Silence. Someone near the end of the table swallowed audibly. The VP's jaw tightened. Those issues are immaterial. Materiality depends on who pays, I replied. And when. Another beat. The investor's gaze drifted to lead counsel, who was already flipping through the folder, pages whispering secrets against his fingertips. There it was, the first crack. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something steadier, like standing on bedrock after months of watching others build castles in sand. The VP straightened, his tone hardening. We can resolve those post-close. Post-close, after signatures, after headlines, after applause. The investor leaned forward now, forearms on the table. Why wasn't this in the executive summary? That question didn't belong to me. It belonged to him. The VP hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But in rooms like this, fractions are fatal. They were under review, he said. Under review. Lead counsel closed the folder slowly, too slowly. I was not made aware of arbitration exposure, he said evenly. The air changed temperature. No one spoke. Even the city beyond the glass seemed to dim. The VP looked at me then, not with dismissal, but calculation. As if reassessing the board, he thought he was winning. He had come in loud, certain that authority could be asserted like a headline. But authority isn't volume, it's gravity. And gravity had just shifted. I met his gaze without blinking, not challenging, not triumphant, just present. Because this wasn't about humiliation, it was about responsibility. The investor tapped the table once. We pause the vote, he said. Full review. Today? A ripple moved through the room, subtle, controlled, but undeniable. The acquisition, moments ago inevitable, now hung in suspension. The VP's voice, when it came, was lower. That's unnecessary. The investor didn't look at him. It's prudent. Prudent. In corporate language, that word means everything and nothing. It means trust has been dented. The meeting adjourned with restrained efficiency. Chairs slid back. Laptops closed. Conversations began in hushed fragments. As people filtered out, I gathered my documents calmly. My hands did not shake, but I could feel his eyes on me. When the room had emptied enough to leave us in a smaller orbit, he stepped closer. You blindsided me, he said quietly. I sent the memo 48 hours ago, I replied. You escalated it. I documented it. There's a difference. His expression flickered. Anger, yes, but beneath it something else. Recognition. You think this wins you something? He asked. I held his gaze. It protects the company, I said. He didn't answer, because for the first time since he had barked that question, do you know who I am? He was beginning to understand that the better question had never been about him. And if you think that was the turning point, you haven't seen what happens when the review begins. By noon, the building felt different, not louder, not chaotic, just alert, like a chessboard after the first unexpected move. Assistants walked faster, doors closed more carefully, even the hum of the elevators seemed to carry rumor from floor to floor. The acquisition review had been scheduled for 3 hours. It lasted 7 minutes before the first real problem surfaced. Lead counsel requested the full environmental report on the Midwest properties. Not the summary, the full report. The one with the appendices nobody reads until they have to. The room this time was smaller, stripped of theatrics. No panoramic skyline, no grand slide deck, just a rectangular table, legal pads, and the investor at the head. The VP arrived late, not dramatically late, just enough to signal irritation. His jaw was set, his tie slightly loosened, as if inconvenience were a personal offense. I had already placed 3 binders on the table. No one commented on that. Lead counsel opened the first binder, flipping directly to the flagged section, a quiet choreography of paper and consequence. He paused halfway through the appendix. "Why is this remediation timeline marked tentative?" he asked. The VP leaned back. "Because negotiations are ongoing." "With whom?" lead counsel asked. A beat. The investor didn't look up, but his pen stopped moving. The VP cleared his throat. "Local regulators." "Which regulators?" lead counsel pressed. Silence again, but this one had weight. I watched the shift happen in real time. Authority doesn't evaporate loudly. It recedes like a tide, exposing what was always underneath. "The State Environmental Board," the VP replied finally. Lead counsel's gaze flicked toward me. Not for permission, for confirmation. "The board issued a preliminary notice of violation 6 weeks ago," I said evenly. "The remediation cost could triple if the timeline extends beyond Q3. The investor looked up then. "Triple?" The word hung between us like a suspended verdict. The VP's fingers tightened around his pen. "Worst-case scenario projections?" "No," I said softly. "Delayed-case scenario projections?" He didn't interrupt this time. Outside the glass wall, clouds gathered over the skyline. The light dimmed just slightly, like the day itself was leaning closer. Lead counsel closed the environmental binder and opened the second, arbitration. 2 pending cases, both buried in subsidiary disclosures, both labeled as non-material. The first involved breach of contract, the second, misrepresentation. "Why were these categorized as non-material?" lead counsel asked. The VP exhaled sharply. "Because the claimed damages are within acceptable thresholds." "Claimed damages," the investor repeated. No one likes the word claimed. It suggests something unfinished, something waiting. I slid a single-page summary across the table. Not to the VP, but to the investor. "The exposure isn't in the claimed damages," I said. "It's in the precedent. If either ruling goes against us pre-close, counterparties in 3 other regions could file similar claims." A quiet, electric pause. The investor scanned the page, then glanced at lead counsel. No panic, just recalculation. The VP leaned forward now, voice tightening. "We can indemnify." "From whom?" lead counsel asked calmly. Another beat. "Indemnification only works when someone has the capacity to pay." The subsidiary did not, and everyone at the table knew it. The room felt smaller with each answer. I wasn't enjoying this. Contrary to what he might have believed, this wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about preventing a headline none of us wanted to read 6 months from now. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Trust was moving, not loudly, not ceremoniously, just inch by inch. The investor closed the arbitration binder and looked directly at the VP. Why was this not elevated? There it was. Not what happened. Why wasn't I told? The VP hesitated again, and this time the hesitation lasted a fraction longer than before. We were managing it internally. Managing, such a gentle word for containment. The investor's gaze shifted to me. "What else?" he asked. 2 words, permission. I opened the third binder. "Compliance breach," I said. "Third-party vendor, data handling irregularities, discovered during internal audit." Lead counsel's expression sharpened. "Personal data?" "Yes." "And disclosure?" "Pending." The investor leaned back slowly, Not angry, just thinking. "How pending?" he asked. 43 days, I answered. The VP's voice cut in. "It was being resolved." "Without disclosure?" lead counsel asked. The air felt thin now. For the first time since this began, the VP looked not irritated, but cornered. I met his eyes briefly. There was no triumph there, only a quiet inevitability. He had mistaken speed for strength, and now the room was measuring something else entirely. The investor folded his hands. "We suspend the acquisition timeline," he said calmly. "Independent review. Immediate." The words landed heavier than any raised voice ever could. The VP's composure cracked just slightly. "That's excessive." "It's necessary," the investor replied. Silence. Outside, the rain finally began, streaking the windows in thin silver lines. The meeting adjourned again, but this time no one rushed out. Conversations were hushed, deliberate. Decisions were already being rebalanced behind polite expressions. As I gathered my binders, lead counsel stepped closer. "Your memo," he said quietly, "was thorough." "Thank you," I replied. He gave a small nod. Respect, not flattery. Across the room, the VP stood alone for a moment, staring at the darkened skyline. For the first time, he wasn't performing. He turned toward me. "This isn't over," he said, not as a threat, but as a statement. I held his gaze. It was never about being over. A flicker of something crossed his face. Understanding? Regret? It was hard to tell. But one thing was certain. The acquisition had paused. And once investors start asking different questions, the answers rarely stay contained. If you think suspension is the worst outcome, wait until the independent review starts uncovering who signed what and when. If you've ever watched power shift in a single sentence, tell me, what would you have done in that room? Subscribe to follow the review as it unfolds. The independent review began without ceremony. No dramatic announcement. No company-wide memo with carefully polished language. Just calendar invites marked confidential and a new law firm's name appearing on the visitor registry before 8 a.m. By midweek, the building felt like a house with its lights on at odd hours. People stayed later. Conversations stopped when someone new stepped into the hallway. Even the hum of printers seemed louder, as if paper itself knew it carried weight now. The external review team arrived in neutral suits and neutral expressions. No one could read them. That was the point. Lead counsel coordinated logistics with the precision of a surgeon. The investor dialed in remotely for the first briefing, and the VP, still technically in charge, sat at the head of the smaller review room, jaw tight, hands folded, as if posture alone could anchor control. I took a seat halfway down the table, not at the head, not at the end. Strategic neutrality. The lead reviewer, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a voice as steady as glass, began with a simple sentence. "We are here to verify disclosure integrity ahead of the acquisition." Verify. Such a calm word for excavation. The first hour passed in document review, environmental notices, arbitration filings, internal emails flagged for context, nothing explosive, just steady peeling back of layers. Every 2 or 3 questions, the rhythm shifted. Who approved this summary? Why was this footnote condensed? When was this first escalated? The VP answered quickly at first, confidently. But confidence has a tempo, and his began to falter. Because the review wasn't about whether issues existed. It was about who knew, and when. By late afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving the skyline sharp and almost unforgiving. Light poured through the windows, illuminating dust motes suspended in the air like quiet witnesses. The reviewer held up a printed email chain. This thread references a draft environmental impact update dated 3 weeks prior to the executive summary, she said. Why was this not attached? A pause. The VP glanced at me, brief, unreadable. It was preliminary, he replied. The reviewer tilted her head slightly. Preliminary data often informs material decisions. Silence. Lead counsel's pen moved again, slow and deliberate. The room felt smaller with every document placed on the table. I wasn't called on to speak at first. That too was intentional. They weren't validating me, they were validating facts. But facts have gravity, and gravity pulls toward whoever documented them first. Midway through the second session, the reviewer shifted focus. Let's discuss the compliance breach, she said. The words carried a different weight. Data handling irregularities, vendor oversight, 43 days of pending disclosure. The VP straightened. We initiated internal remediation. Before notifying the board? The reviewer asked. Yes. Why? A longer silence this time. The air conditioning hummed faintly overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed softly. The world outside continued as usual. Inside, timelines were being measured in seconds. It was operational, he said finally. Operational. I had heard that word before. The reviewer's gaze moved to me. When were you informed? 48 hours after internal audit flagged the issue, I said. I recommended immediate disclosure and board notification. Documented? Yes. Lead counsel slid a printed memo across the table. My memo. The reviewer read silently. No one spoke. There's a peculiar tension when truth becomes visible on paper. It doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse. It simply exists. The VP exhaled slowly. This could have been managed without escalation, he said. The reviewer looked up. Escalation to whom? To the board, to the investor. The room went still, because that was the heart of it, not whether there were issues, whether the right people were told. The reviewer closed the folder gently. Disclosure integrity is not a matter of preference, she said. It's structural. Structural. The word settled like concrete. By the third session, interviews expanded beyond executives. Analysts were called in, compliance officers, even a junior associate from legal who had flagged an inconsistency in the arbitration summary. Patterns began to form. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, no public unraveling, just a consistent thread. Concerns raised, minimized, delayed. The VP maintained composure, but something in his posture had shifted. Less command, more containment. On Friday evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the glass towers in copper light, the review team requested one final document set. Email timestamps, specific ones. The room quieted again. Timestamps don't argue. They don't interpret. They simply record. When the documents were printed, the silence was almost physical. The environmental notice had been received 11 days before the executive summary was finalized. The arbitration exposure had been discussed internally 2 weeks prior. The compliance breach had been labeled sensitive limit circulation. Limit circulation. The phrase lingered. The reviewer closed her folder. We will prepare our preliminary findings for the board, she said calmly. No verdict, not yet. But the air had changed. As people gathered their papers, the VP remained seated. For a moment, no one approached him, not out of disrespect, out of recalibration. He looked up at me as I stood. You pushed for this, he said quietly. I pushed for transparency, I replied. A long pause. You've made your point. This was the moment some might savor. I didn't, because this wasn't about points. It was about structure, and structure, once cracked, reveals everything built on top of it. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, steady and indifferent. Inside, the review team carried their files toward the elevator. If you think the preliminary findings are the climax, you're underestimating what happens when a board reads them line by line. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m. No rescheduling, no delays. The kind of punctuality that signals seriousness. By 8:15, the executive floor was already awake. Assistants moved with quiet precision, placing water glasses exactly equidistant from leather portfolios. The long walnut table reflected the ceiling lights in clean, unwavering lines. Outside, the city shimmered under a clear sky, deceptively calm. Inside, nothing was calm. The investor arrived first, not flanked, not announced, just present. He greeted no one with unnecessary warmth, but his nod carried weight. Lead counsel followed with a slim binder, far thinner than the stacks from last week. Concise documents are always more dangerous. They mean someone has already done the sorting. The VP entered last. His suit was impeccable, his expression carefully neutral, but the room no longer tilted toward him the way it had on his first day. Authority hadn't vanished, it had thinned. I took my usual seat midway down the table. Not hidden, not central, steady. The chair of the board, a woman whose calm could steady a storm, opened the meeting without preamble. "We've reviewed the independent findings," she said. No raised voices, no theatrics, just facts waiting their turn. Lead counsel summarized first: environmental exposure, undisclosed timing discrepancies, arbitration cases categorized prematurely as non-material, compliance breach, delayed board notification, none individually catastrophic. Together, patterned. The word landed softly. The VP sat upright, hands clasped. "There was no intent to mislead," he said evenly. "These were judgment calls made under time pressure to secure the acquisition." Secure. Such a strong word for something now paused indefinitely. The investor leaned forward slightly. "Judgment requires disclosure," he said. "Pressure doesn't eliminate obligation." Silence stretched across polished wood. I could feel eyes flick toward me, then away. This wasn't my moment to speak. The structure was handling itself now. But then the board chair turned her gaze in my direction. "You recommended immediate escalation," she said. "Yes," I answered. "Why?" A simple question. Because it was right, I could have said. Because the numbers didn't align. Instead, I chose something else. Because risk compounds quietly, I said. And reputational damage costs more than remediation. A faint nod from the investor. The VP's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in realization. The board chair folded her hands. "This isn't about punishing initiative," she said. "It's about protecting governance." Governance. The room absorbed the word. Lead counsel slid a single sheet across the table. A recommendation: temporary reassignment of oversight authority for the acquisition and related disclosures, independent compliance supervision, direct reporting line adjustments, not a firing, not humiliation, structural correction. The VP read the page once, then again. His voice, when it came, was controlled. "You're sidelining me." "No," the investor replied calmly. "We're rebalancing oversight." Rebalancing, another quiet word that shifts entire careers. The board chair looked at him steadily. "Leadership is measured by response to scrutiny," she said. "How you proceed now will define more than this deal." There it was, the opening he hadn't expected. Not exile, accountability. The room held its breath. For a moment, I wondered which version of him would answer. The one who barked titles across tables, or the one who had stared at the skyline alone after the review. He exhaled slowly. I accept the board's decision, he said. No drama, no defiance, just acceptance. The tension in the room loosened, not vanished but softened. The acquisition would remain paused pending remediation and full disclosure updates. A revised executive summary would be drafted, environmental negotiations accelerated, arbitration contingencies formalized, vendor compliance reported transparently, and oversight. That shifted, not loudly, but undeniably. As the meeting adjourned, chairs moved back with restrained finality. The investor approached me near the window overlooking the city. You handled this professionally, he said. Thank you. You understand, he added, this wasn't about winning. I know. He studied me for a moment. We need that steadiness. Need, not praise, responsibility. Across the room, the VP stood speaking quietly with lead counsel. Their conversation looked different now, less hierarchical, more measured. When he finally approached, there was no bark in his voice. You were right about disclosure, he said. It wasn't easy for him. I was right about timing, I corrected gently. We both want the company stable. A flicker of something almost like respect passed between us. This wasn't revenge, it was recalibration. As the board members exited, sunlight streamed fully into the room, bright and unapologetic. The skyline looked sharper than ever, every building outlined in clarity. The acquisition would move forward, but differently, more transparent, more deliberate. And, as for authority, it no longer needed to shout to be recognized. If you think structural correction ends the story, wait until the market reacts to how it was handled. Markets don't react to noise, they react to signals. The revised executive summary was released on Thursday morning at exactly 7:30 a.m. Before the opening bell, before speculation could run wild, the document was clean, transparent, almost surgical in its clarity. Environmental exposure quantified, arbitration contingencies outlined, compliance breach disclosed with remediation steps already in motion. No spin, just structure. By 8:05, internal dashboards began lighting up. Analysts tracking pre-market sentiment reported something unexpected. Stability, not a surge, not a dip. Stability. The investor sent a brief message to the executive group. Measured transparency builds long-term value. Measured? The word echoed the tone of the past week. In the operations wing, my team watched the numbers update in real time. No champagne, no dramatic applause, just quiet exhalations and steady typing. One of the junior analysts leaned toward me. They're not panicking, she whispered, almost surprised. They rarely do when they're told the truth, I replied. 2 floors above, the VP stood before a smaller group of senior managers. I wasn't in the room, but I heard about it later, not through gossip, but through tone. He acknowledged the oversight shift. He acknowledged the review findings. He acknowledged the importance of disclosure. No bark, no theatrics, just recalibration. By mid-morning, a financial publication released a brief note. Company delays acquisition to strengthen compliance framework. Investors respond positively to governance transparency. Positively. That word carried more power than any title. Lead counsel stopped by my office just before lunch. No folder this time, just a quiet knock. The board has formalized the oversight adjustment, he said. You'll co-chair the acquisition committee with interim reporting authority. The sentence settled slowly. Co-chair. Not a reward, a responsibility. I understand, I said. He studied me for a moment. You didn't escalate to embarrass him. No. You escalated to protect the structure. Yes. A faint nod. That's why this worked. After he left, I stood by the window for a moment, watching traffic flow far below like a system that never fully stops. The skyline looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. The victory wasn't loud. There were no headlines naming me, no dramatic reshuffling announced with fanfare. But in conference rooms, when discussions shifted toward risk, eyes now turned in my direction, not out of suspicion, but trust. Later that afternoon, the VP knocked on my door. He didn't wait for an invitation to enter, but he didn't assume it either. "We need to align on the revised environmental timeline," he said. "Need, not command." I gestured toward the chair across from me. "Let's." We reviewed projections together, adjusted assumptions, flagged contingencies early instead of late. It wasn't warm, but it was professional. At one point, he paused. "I misjudged you," he said quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't apologetic in a performative way. Just factual. "You misjudged the process," I replied. "It happens." A faint half smile. "You don't hold grudges?" "Not when documentation does the work." He let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. The tension that had once electrified every exchange between us had dissipated into something steadier. Mutual awareness. Guarded respect. Outside, the sun began to lower again, casting long gold streaks across glass towers. The city pulsed forward, indifferent to individual egos. By closing bell, the company's stock had ticked upward, not dramatically, but enough to signal confidence. The acquisition would proceed, stronger, cleaner, watched more carefully. And as the final reports of the day circulated, one line in the internal governance summary stood out. Disclosure protocols updated to require cross-functional sign-off prior to executive summary finalization. Cross-functional, no more narrow lanes, no more stay in your function. That evening, as the office lights dimmed one by one, I gathered my files without urgency. The storm that had threatened to fracture the structure had instead reinforced it. Authority hadn't shifted because someone shouted louder. It shifted because someone documented better. Because someone understood that power isn't proven by asking, "Do you know who I am?" It's proven when the room already does.